The most dangerous enemy Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis ever faced wasn't a mobster with concrete shoes or a studio executive with a vendetta. It was America's beloved comedian, a man who smiled for the cameras while sharpening knives behind the scenes. On a scorching July afternoon in 1954, inside the marble corridors of Paramount Studios, Bob Hope was orchestrating the destruction of the hottest comedy team in Hollywood. But Bob Hope had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He thought Dean Martin was just a pretty boy singer who got lucky. He was about to discover that beneath that cool exterior was a strategist who could outplay the master of comedy politics at his own game. The executive conference room, on the third floor of Paramount's administration building, was a temple to Hollywood power. Mahogany paneling absorbed whispered conspiracies. Crystal decanters reflected the ambitions of men who traded in dreams and nightmares with equal profit. The Persian carpet had muffled the footsteps of legends and witnessed the burial of careers that threatened the established order. This afternoon it would host a meeting that would determine whether Martin and Lewis would survive their meteoric rise or crash and burn like so many shooting stars before them. Bob Hope sat at the head of the polished conference table, his famous smile nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face wore the expression of a general planning a siege. At 51, Hope was the undisputed king of American comedy. He had conquered radio, movies, and television. His USO tours made him a national hero. His road pictures with Bing Crosby had redefined box office success. For nearly 2 decades, Bob Hope had been the measuring stick by which all other comedians were judged. But now, for the first time in his career, Bob Hope felt the cold breath of obsolescence on his neck. The men seated around the table represented the true power at Paramount Studios. Studio head Frank Freeman, whose signature could launch careers or end them with equal finality. Production chief Don Hartman, who decided which projects lived and died. A handful of vice presidents, whose names appeared on no credits, but whose influence shaped every decision. These were the men who really ran Hollywood, and today they were listening to Bob Hope explain why Martin and Lewis had to be stopped. "Gentlemen," Hope said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never heard the word no in a professional context. "We have a problem, a serious problem, that threatens not just Paramount's established order, but the very foundation of what comedy means to American audiences." Freeman leaned forward, his fingers steepled. He was a cautious man who had survived studio politics by never making enemies unnecessarily. But he also understood that Paramount's future depended on backing the right horses. "What exactly are you proposing, Bob?" Hope stood and walked to the window, gazing down at the studio lot where thousands of people worked to create the illusion of magic. In the distance, he could see Stage 7, where Martin and Lewis were currently filming Living It Up, their latest picture. Even from 3 stories up, he could hear the occasional burst of laughter from the crew. "Martin and Lewis are amateurs," Hope said, his voice dripping with disdain. "They're a fad, a temporary aberration that's confusing audiences about what real comedy looks like. Jerry Lewis is nothing but a spastic child having a tantrum. Dean Martin is a second-rate crooner who can't carry a scene without his monkey of a partner." The silence in the room was telling. Hope had just called the studio's biggest moneymakers amateurs. Martin and Lewis weren't just successful, they were phenomenally successful. Their pictures consistently outperformed Hope's recent efforts at the box office. Their nightclub appearances sold out instantly. Their radio show dominated the ratings. But Hope wasn't finished. "I've been watching their performances, gentlemen, studying them, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that their success is built on a foundation of sand. They have no technique, no timing, no understanding of what comedy actually requires. They're succeeding because audiences don't know any better." Hartman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Bob, their numbers don't lie. Scared Stiff made us $4 million. The Caddy is tracking to do even better." Hope's jaw tightened. Those numbers were exactly the problem. "Money isn't everything, Don. We have a responsibility to maintain standards, to preserve the integrity of American comedy, and Martin and Lewis represent everything that's wrong with this business. They're flashy, they're shallow, and they're corrupting the art form that men like myself have spent decades perfecting." What Hope didn't say, what he couldn't admit, even to himself, was that he was terrified. At 51, he was watching a younger generation of performers capture the spotlight he had owned for 2 decades. Martin and Lewis represented a new style of comedy that made Hope's carefully crafted routines seem dated and mechanical. They were loose where he was rigid, spontaneous where he was calculated, authentic where he was polished. Hope had spent his entire career being the smartest man in every room, the comedian who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outperform anyone who challenged him. But Martin and Lewis weren't playing by the rules he understood. They weren't trying to be Bob Hope. They were creating something entirely new, and it was working. "So what do you suggest we do about it?" Freeman asked carefully. Hope returned to his seat, his expression grim. "We give them enough rope to hang themselves. Living it up is already over budget. The schedule is behind. Jerry's perfectionism is driving the crew crazy. All we need to do is apply a little pressure, create a few problems, and let their own incompetence destroy them." The men around the table exchanged glances. What Hope was suggesting was sabotage, subtle, deniable, but sabotage nonetheless. "We delay the editing," Hope continued. "We question every expense. We make them reshoot scenes that are perfectly fine. We create chaos and then blame them for not being able to handle the pressure of a major production." Freeman frowned. "That's a dangerous game, Bob. If they deliver a hit despite our interference, we look foolish." "They won't deliver a hit," Hope said with absolute confidence, "because they're not professionals. They're lucky amateurs, and luck runs out when the pressure gets real." Hope reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting their unprofessional behavior for weeks. Jerry's tantrums, Dean's lackadaisical attitude, their disrespect for established crew members, their refusal to accept direction from experienced professionals." He slid the folder across the table to Freeman. "Everything you need to justify increasing oversight on their production. Everything you need to make their lives miserable until they break." Freeman opened the folder and began reading. Page after page of reports, photographs, witness statements, all painting Martin and Lewis as difficult, unprofessional, and unworthy of their success. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, compiled with the thoroughness of a man who had been planning this destruction for months. "This is very thorough, Bob," Freeman said slowly. "I don't do anything halfway," Hope replied. "When I commit to something, I see it through to the end." But while Bob Hope was orchestrating Martin and Lewis's downfall 3 floors above them, the comedy duo was creating magic on Stage 7. Living It Up was their most ambitious picture yet, a musical comedy that showcased both Dean's singing and Jerry's physical comedy, while exploring themes of friendship and loyalty that mirrored their real-life partnership. The atmosphere on set was electric. Director Norman Taurog, a veteran who had worked with everyone from Judy Garland to Mickey Rooney, watched in amazement as Dean and Jerry transformed scripted scenes into something approaching improvised brilliance. They anticipated each other's movements, built on each other's ideas, created moments that couldn't be planned or manufactured. "Cut," Taurog called after a particularly inspired sequence. "That was magnificent, absolutely magnificent." Jerry bounced on his feet, his energy barely contained. "Did you see when Dean grabbed my arm? That wasn't in the script, but it felt perfect, so I went with it." Dean smiled, lighting a cigarette with casual elegance. "Kids got good instincts. Sometimes you just have to trust the moment." The crew burst into spontaneous applause, something that almost never happened during filming. These were professionals who had seen everything, worked with the biggest stars in Hollywood, but there was something special about watching Martin and Lewis work together. But their celebration was interrupted by the arrival of studio executive Harold Mirisch, a thin, nervous man who served as Freeman's eyes and ears on active productions. His expression was grim as he approached Taurog. "Norman, we need to talk. Privately." Taurog's face fell. In 30 years of directing, he knew that tone. It meant trouble, big trouble. They huddled in a corner of the stage, while Martin and Lewis continued working on their next scene. Mirisch spoke in hushed, urgent tones, occasionally glancing at the comedy duo with an expression that mixed frustration with resignation. Dean noticed the conversation immediately. His years of experience in nightclubs and recording studios had taught him to read the room, to sense when the atmosphere changed. The way Mirisch kept looking at them, the way Taurog's shoulders tensed, Something was wrong. Jerry, Dean said quietly, interrupting his partner mid-sentence. Look at Tarag. Jerry followed Dean's gaze and immediately understood. The director's body language had changed completely. Where moments before he had been animated and enthusiastic, now he looked like a man receiving bad news. What do you think? Jerry asked. I think we're about to have company, Dean replied. Sure enough, Mirish walked over to them with the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. Gentlemen, I'm afraid I have some concerns about the production that need to be addressed immediately. Dean and Jerry exchanged glances. They had been through enough studio politics to know when they were being set up. What kind of concerns? Dean asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mirish pulled out a clipboard covered with notes. Budget overruns, schedule delays, reports of unprofessional behavior on set. The front office is beginning to question whether this production is being managed properly. Jerry's face flushed red. Unprofessional behavior? What are you talking about? We've been early to every call, we know our lines, we're giving you the best work of our careers. That may be your perception, Mirish said coldly, but the reports I'm receiving paint a different picture. Temperamental outbursts, refusal to follow direction, disrespect for established crew members. Dean took a step forward, and for the first time Mirish saw something dangerous flash behind those cool blue eyes. Harold, Dean said quietly. Who exactly is filing these reports? Mirish's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. That's confidential studio business. Is it Bob Hope? The question hung in the air like smoke from Dean's cigarette. Mirish's face gave him away immediately, a flicker of surprise, a momentary loss of composure that confirmed what Dean had already suspected. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Dean interrupted. I'm asking a direct question. Is Bob Hope behind these reports? Jerry was catching on quickly. His mind was racing, connecting dots that should have been obvious. Hope's recent coldness at industry events, the way he'd been asking pointed questions about their upcoming projects, the suspicious timing of these concerns, just as their picture was hitting its stride. That son of a bitch, Jerry whispered. Mirish backed away, clearly out of his depth. I'm simply reporting what the front office has told me. From now on, all creative decisions need to be approved by a studio supervisor. All expenses over $50 require written authorization, and any delays or budget overruns will result in severe consequences. He turned and walked away quickly, leaving Martin and Lewis standing on the soundstage, surrounded by crew members who had heard every word. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Dean did something that surprised everyone. He started laughing. What's so funny? Jerry asked. Bobby thinks he's playing chess, Dean said, stubbing out his cigarette. But he doesn't realize we've been playing poker our whole lives. Dean walked over to the phone on the wall, a direct line to various departments throughout the studio. He dialed a number from memory. Edith, it's Dean Martin. Is Mr. Freeman available? Tell him it's urgent. Jerry watched his partner with growing excitement. He'd seen that look before, usually right before Dean pulled off something brilliant. Mr. Freeman, Dean Martin, I wonder if you could spare a few minutes this afternoon. Jerry and I would like to discuss our future at Paramount with you. Today, if possible. Thank you. Dean hung up and turned to Jerry. We have a meeting at 4 o'clock. What are you thinking? Dean's smile was cold and calculating. I'm thinking it's time to remind everyone in this town exactly who Martin and Lewis are, and what happens when someone tries to play games with us. At precisely 4 o'clock, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis walked into Frank Freeman's office with the confidence of men who had nothing to lose. Freeman was seated behind his massive desk, flanked by Don Hartman and Harold Mirish. Bob Hope was nowhere to be seen, but his influence hung over the room like expensive cologne. Gentlemen, Freeman said, gesturing to 2 chairs. Please, sit down. Dean remained standing. Jerry followed his lead. We'll stand, thanks, Dean said. This won't take long. Freeman's eyebrows rose. In 30 years of running studios, he wasn't accustomed to performers setting the tone of meetings. Harold tells me you wanted to discuss your future at Paramount, Freeman said carefully. That's right, Dean replied. We wanted to let you know that we're terminating our contract. The silence that followed was deafening. Freeman, Hartman, and Mirish stared at Martin and Lewis as if they had just announced their intention to fly to the moon. "I'm sorry," Freeman said slowly. "Did you say terminating?" "Effective immediately," Jerry added, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were doing. Freeman found his voice. "Gentlemen, you can't simply terminate your contract. You have legal obligations, financial commitments. Living it up isn't finished." Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out a document that made Freeman's face go pale. "Actually, we can. Clause 47 of our contract states that we can terminate immediately if the studio fails to provide a professional working environment, free from harassment and interference." He placed the document on Freeman's desk. "Our lawyers have determined that the recent oversight and concerns constitute a breach of that clause, especially since we have evidence that these issues are being manufactured by someone with a personal vendetta against us." Freeman picked up the document with shaking hands. Martin and Lewis weren't just threatening to leave, they had the legal right to leave, and if they left, Paramount would lose its biggest moneymakers and face a potential lawsuit. "What do you want?" Freeman asked quietly. "We want Bob Hope out of our business," Dean said bluntly. "Permanently. We want Harold Mirish removed from our production. We want written guarantees that no studio executive will interfere with our creative process without cause, and we want a formal apology from anyone involved in this sabotage attempt." Jerry stepped forward. "Or we walk, today, and we take our story to every newspaper and trade publication in Los Angeles." The threat was clear. Martin and Lewis weren't just Paramount's biggest stars, they were America's sweethearts. If news leaked that the studio had been sabotaging them at Bob Hope's behest, the public relations nightmare would be catastrophic. Freeman looked at Hartman, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They had no choice. "I'll need to make some calls," Freeman said. "Make them," Dean replied. "We'll wait." 30 minutes later, Bob Hope sat in Frank Freeman's office, receiving the worst news of his professional life. His sabotage campaign had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Martin and Lewis had outmaneuvered him completely, turning his own weapons against him. "They know everything, Bob," Freeman said grimly, "and they have lawyers who are very eager to make this public." Hope's famous composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I was trying to protect the studio's interests." "You were trying to protect your own interests," Hartman replied coldly, "and in doing so, you nearly cost us our most profitable stars." Freeman slid a document across his desk. "This is a formal apology that you will sign and deliver personally to Martin and Lewis. You will also agree to have no professional contact with them for the duration of their contract with this studio." Hope stared at the document as if it were a death warrant. In a way, it was. By forcing him to apologize publicly, Martin and Lewis weren't just defeating him, they were humiliating him in front of the entire industry. But Hope had no choice. If he refused, Freeman would side with Martin and Lewis completely, and Hope's own Paramount contract would be in jeopardy. With a hand that shook slightly, Bob Hope signed his name to the apology. The next morning, Living It Up resumed production without interference. The movie was completed on schedule and under budget, becoming one of Paramount's biggest hits of 1954. Martin and Lewis's star continued to rise, while Bob Hope watched from the sidelines, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to destroy what you couldn't understand.